Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, we would love to connect. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I do apologize if you heard that video without sound. That was completely my fault, but hopefully the visuals were successful. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself. So please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last portion of the conversation to respond to the questions you post. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed on Friday to all who registered, and we are streaming the webinar on Facebook Live. All resources that you see shared as links in the chat will be compiled and shared in a follow-up email to all webinar registrants, and materials are accessible on GLR's Community Learning for Impact and Improvement platform, aka CLIP. We invite you to take a few seconds to create a free account if you've not yet done so that you don't miss the materials from today's session. Finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Lastly, before we begin, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Next week, we have an exciting doubleheader with a Crucible of Practice Salon at 12:30 Eastern Time, featuring the Moonshot Literacy Movement created by partners in Indian River, Florida. Later that day, we'll be joined by Miriam Calderon, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Policy and Early Learning at the U.S. Department of Education, on a session exploring English language learners and equitable learning recovery. Lastly, the following week, we'll start off with an exciting funder-to-funder conversation, seizing the moment, philanthropic strategies to promote the child tax credit. Information and registration for these upcoming sessions are posted in the chat box, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is Sarah Torian, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesday session, Learning at Home and in the Classroom, Innovations in Curricula and Professional Learning, co-sponsored by our partners at Overdeck Family Foundation. As you all know, the past 18 months have posed many challenges for all of us, but it's posed particular challenges for teachers and parents. Teachers who had to adapt to teaching virtually, and parents who had to become teachers at home while also balancing myriad other responsibilities. Their experiences underscore the importance of high-quality instructional materials and high-quality professional learning that can strengthen the connections between the adults who play these two critical roles. We've seen a number of innovations in curricula and professional learning during COVID-19, and we at the campaign like to call these types of innovations keepers because they can and should be sustained because their benefits can extend far beyond the pandemic. In today's session, we'll be lifting up a few of those keepers and other insights gleaned during the pandemic, and we'll be discussing how they might inform future efforts to support learning at home and in the classroom. And to begin that conversation, I'm incredibly honored to welcome and introduce our moderator for today, Laurie Stzejnberg. Laurie is the Director of Research for the Overdeck Family Foundation and Senior Program Officer for the Exceptional Educators Portfolio, which aims to empower teachers to unlock students' excitement for learning. Laurie has spent nearly 20 years in the field of education doing both research and direct service, including roles at TNTP, Success Academy Charter Schools, McKinsey & Company, and MDRC. Welcome, Laurie. Thanks so much for joining us and for moderating today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Excuse me. I am thrilled to be here and very excited to be here to discuss innovation in professional learning, staffing, and curriculum as a result of the changes that how students have been experiencing learning in the classroom and in their homes. Like the campaign at the Overdeck Family Foundation, we believe that learning happens in both classrooms and at home. And that strong curricula and professional learning are some of the most important levers to supporting teachers and students. Our work centers around the deep belief that teachers are the most important factor in a student's education and that we need to wrap supports around the teacher to be able to support them in achieving their best for their students. Research has shown high quality materials are one of the most effective tools to enhance student academic achievement. And studies on the efficacy of professional learning show that it should be, at a minimum, curriculum aligned, since this is the fastest way to make professional learning relevant to those teachers' current students. But we also can't ignore what has happened over the last year and a half, where learning was taking place in classrooms with teachers and in partnership with families at home. What made this experience better for students was ensuring teachers could do their best work and anchoring to high quality content, which requires strong professional learning. That's why I'm so excited for today's conversation with 5 leaders who have been working on innovating and studying how to support student learning in classrooms and at home. We'll use this time together today to better understand the role that high quality instructional materials and high quality professional learning played in improving the school-home connection and addressing teacher staffing concerns. With that, I am honored to welcome and introduce today's panel of leaders in this work. In alphabetical order by last name, I'd like to first introduce Liz Chu. Elizabeth Chu is the Executive Director of Columbia University's Center for Public Research and Leadership and a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. She is an educator, social science researcher, and working mom of 3. Welcome, Liz. Next, Bryan Hassel. Bryan is the co-president of Public Impact and co-leader of its Opportunity Culture Initiative. More than 400 schools are now implementing opportunity culture models that extend the reach of excellent teachers and their teams for higher pay within recurring budgets, transforming professional learning. Welcome, Bryan. Sarah Johnson is the CEO of Teaching Lab, a national nonprofit organization with a mission to fundamentally shift the paradigm of teacher professional learning for educational equity. Sarah previously held leadership positions with the Overdeck Family Foundation and the New York City Department of Education, and was a high school science teacher and founder of a social justice student leadership program in Washington, D.C. and Oakland, California. Welcome, Sarah. David Rosenberg is a partner at Education Resource Strategies, sorry, David, a national nonprofit that helps districts, school, and state leaders transform how they use resources to ensure excellence with equity for all students. David leads ERS's human capital practice and is co-author of Growing Great Teachers, an assessment of how district leaders can sustainably provide differentiated supports for rookie teachers, and Igniting the Learning Engine, a study of how the most effective systems organize to enable strategic professional learning. Thank you, David, for being here. And lastly, but not leastly, Lauren Weisskirk is the Chief Strategy Officer at EdReports.org, overseeing the organization's communications, outreach, and impact priorities. She works throughout the country supporting states and districts to prioritize high-quality materials that will best meet the needs of their students. So first, I'd like to engage with David and Bryan on some of the staffing shifts and challenges during COVID-19. Let's begin our conversation with a grounding in the data and evidence, and apologies for the dog, that has occurred during COVID, especially in teacher staffing. David, you have been on the ground, working in districts and in schools, both before and during the pandemic. How have you seen teacher staffing change to meet the needs of students, acknowledging that some are the same and some are different? What would you point to as an innovation that you would recommend that we keep post-pandemic?
Yeah, well, first off, Laurie, thank you. And thanks to everyone, for our panelists and for everyone who joined us today. I would like to ground my answer to your first question in just this understanding of how districts are planning to invest federal stimulus funds in general. And I'm going to put a little note in the chat for folks in a moment. So here at ERS, we have been anchoring our work with districts on what we're calling these power strategies, and I'll link those here now, for equity, focused recovery and system redesign. And so about half the money, based on our analysis of district plans that we've been seeing, about half the money that districts are getting in planning to use an ESSER is going to some form of those power strategies, the biggest bulk being creating more time and attention for kids, which makes sense, right? This is what we're hearing about in terms of tutoring, summer learning, extended day. And then about half the money is going to other things like tech, facilities, health and safety, and all of that. And so to answer a question about what's happening with staffing and teaching, I think we need to ground it in what are the strategies the district teams have been pursuing. And a lot of that really is about how do we extend time and provide more small group attention for kids. Of course, we're in a labor market where finding more people and able to do that is incredibly difficult. And most of the things you see on the right side of this slide in blue require us asking more of existing staff or hiring new staff who may or may not exist in the markets that we're in. So on the next slide, what we describe is, broadly speaking, how we're seeing districts adjust staffing to meet student needs. And then I'd like to share one example that I think, Laurie, gets to your last question about what are some innovations that we might want to keep. So first off, there's the obvious one of let's ask our current people to do more and let's pay them for it. Given the nature of the teaching role before the pandemic and the nature of the teaching role over the last 18 months, in most places, that's a really tough ask, but it's working and happening. A second thing we see is districts reallocating existing time. And this predates the pandemic as well, of building strategic schedules that allow for more planning time without increasing your need for staff. And it's a set of technical decisions you can make that create a different cadence of the teaching job and the student day. And then the third and fourth pieces is where you start expanding the universe of who's working with kids, right? And that's where things, I think, really start to get more interesting and innovative. We've bucketed it here into tapping into what we would consider non-traditional sources of talent. So high school students serving as tutors, teaching residents taking on bigger roles, retired teachers being given more opportunities to work back in schools. And then I think even most exciting is how do we think about community partners expanding after school options or pushing into the school day, or even providing non-instructional support like lunchtime duties, recess, other activities that reduces the need for us to ask our educators and other staff to fulfill many of those roles that essentially are outside the core work of instruction. And so to choose one example on the next slide that I'll share, this is from a district in Texas. They have merged some of these ideas where to a point where once a week, their schedule for students looks very different, right? There's more time for intervention, as you see in the green on the right. And then there's a half day where kids are working directly through on a community service project with a partner organization facilitated by a subset of teachers and by high school student volunteers. And that's the time when teachers are really getting to do more planning work together. And so if there's one innovation that we saw during the pandemic that I would start with as a foundation for change is rethinking time so teachers are able to spend more time doing the planning work required to use high quality instructional materials and to really create rich learning experiences for kids.
Thank you so much for that, David. Bryan, I'd like to welcome you in and ask you to comment on the fact that nearly every day we see a new report on the negative impact of teacher shortages on classrooms across the country, and how difficult it can be to recruit and retain teachers. What lessons can public impacts opportunity culture model offer during this difficult time for teacher staffing? What have you seen work?
Yes, Laurie, I mean, even before COVID, these shortages were already acute. They were growing, especially in certain subjects. especially in the high need schools like the ones that Opportunity Culture Initiative engages. And so what is possible to address these shortages in a fundamental way? Let me just talk briefly about some of the things we've learned. At the heart of opportunity culture is the idea of grouping teachers into teams and then have a multi-classroom leader, a proven excellent teacher with prior success, lead that team of teachers. MCL for short. The MCL keeps teaching, but they also lead other teachers on the team every day. And they use schedules like the one David showed earlier or other rearrangements to ensure they have time to collaborate and support their teams. So what does this have to do with shortages? Well, there are three connections I want to make. One is research suggests that better support for teachers, especially new ones, will keep them in the classroom longer. And so MCLs are giving their team members 6 or 7 hours a week of support, much more than a typical teacher will receive. And it's coming from a teacher leader who's been carefully selected for their prior success and has some leadership competencies as well. So that should increase retention, which then helps with shortages. So that's number one. Number two, these MCLs are really well paid. They are earning salary supplements 20% above the salary schedule on average, sometimes up to 50%. And that's enough to make great teachers stay in the profession for longer, again, increasing retention and addressing shortages. And then finally, I'd say the team structure also allows for some creative responses to shortage. For example, rather than filling every single vacancy with someone, even someone who's not qualified to teach well, teams can organize so that paraprofessionals, teacher residents, some of the other staff ideas that David shared on the last slide can play critical instructional roles. And then some of these folks will go on to become teachers, and that helps fuel the diverse pipeline that we need to address shortages long term. So in contrast, if schools stick with the one teacher, one classroom model that's so common, addressing shortages is very, very challenging. The team model makes it easier.
Thank you, Bryan. David, is there anything else that you'd like to add here? Any examples additional to what you've already shared that you can share from your district and school partners where you have seen them making stronger or more innovative decisions with regards to teacher staffing?
Yeah, and I think in thinking about that, we also want to recognize the challenges on the ground that many of those folks, many of you who are here and work directly in schools and districts are facing, just to get back to the base level of operations with teachers. And so sort of the humility and recognition of those challenges becomes important. We've been talking about it as the challenge of putting out fires while tending your gardens, and I'll pass that link on in a sec. So I think the notion of rethinking time, as I alluded to earlier, but I would just emphasize Bryan's point about rethinking roles. And I think we're starting to see more dialogue about how to do that, thinking forward, because the job of teaching itself needs to become more rewarding and collaborative and sustainable. If we're gonna, and so this is a moment when we are starting to see folks recognize that need and start to go there. It is starting to happen with things like planning time, things like opportunity culture that demonstrate what's possible. I think we're 10% of the way towards the potential of what we can be doing over the next couple of years.
Thank you so much, David. I'd like to bring Liz, Lauren, and Sarah into the conversation. We know that there was a lot of distress and need for innovation across the sector. And we just heard a bit about teacher staffing changed and evolved during the pandemic. I want to turn now in this conversation to that homeschool connection, especially where it relates to curricula. So starting with you, Liz, we have long known that what happens at home is an important component of a student's education. And yet the emphasis on the homeschool connection has seemed almost, I'm going to put it in air quotes, new these past 18 some odd months. What do we know about innovation when it comes to a strong homeschool connection? And what does your research and general research in the field show?
It's a great question, and thanks so much for having me, Laurie. We're thrilled to be here. So at CPRL, we spent the past 18-ish months, year and a half, studying pandemic schooling to do a couple of things. First, we wanted to help kids, families, teachers meet what was an extremely challenging moment. And second, we wanted to figure out how to build a stronger and more equitable education system moving forward. In the course of our work, we conducted hundreds of interviews with students, families, educators, instructional leaders, system leaders, community members, and others who are crucial to the education ecosystem. And what we saw and learned is that we witnessed an innovation that gets at the heart or the core of teaching and learning. Pre-pandemic, the focus of the instructional process was previously thought to have 3 points: student, teacher, content, or materials. During the pandemic, we saw this process shift from a 3-pointed model to one with 4 fundamental points: student, teacher, instructional materials, and the family. This 4-pointed relationship was so powerful that even in the most challenging of circumstances, we were in the midst of a pandemic, we're in the midst of a racial reckoning, we saw that when students were supported by all of those other 3 anchors, the student, the school, the family, and those high quality instructional materials, they learned as much, if not more, than in a typical year. The question you asked was about innovation, and you put new in air quotes, and I would underscore that. One thing that we often skip over when we think about innovation from the pandemic is how innovative this 4-pointed relationship is. It is really hard to overstate that level of innovation, because like so many things in education, we see a huge amount of historic variability into how families are brought into decisions about schooling, and how communities, schools, and individuals have a voice in decisions that are made around the teaching and learning process. We see, if we look historically, that the way it looks for upper middle class families, often wealthier, whiter families, is that they have much more of a voice in making decisions around teaching and learning and shaping what schooling looks like, and that's well documented. It's also well documented that that has not been the case in low-income communities of color. It's the case that in those communities historically, family engagement has been much more focused on compliance, sometimes compliance at its best, and making the teaching and learning process completely inaccessible to families at the worst. And that changed for kids and communities across the country because of COVID. What we hear is that students, families, and teachers want to carry forward those positive lessons that were learned during this difficult time, not just focusing on overcoming the learning loss through the methods that were used before the pandemic. They want leaders to think big. They want to continue to have individualized learning, and they want to be prepared for college, career, and the real world that awaits them after they graduate. They want to be able to think creatively, to the points that were just made by the previous panelists about when, how, and where the learning process takes place so that they can meet their academic and life goals. And what we see is that in order to do those things well, in order to provide individualized student-centered education, that fundamental 4 has to be intact. We have to have high-quality curriculum, students, families, and teachers working together on behalf of our kids. And we need to see how those moments of teaching and learning fit into broader school-wide and system-wide visions for innovation.
And building on that, Liz, I'm wondering what impact this has had on curricula creators. How have you seen the homeschool connection become more important to them? And how do educators feel about this shift? What have you learned about those things through the research?
We saw that for high quality curriculum creators, the experiences of families, teachers, and students was top of mind throughout the pandemic. Those high quality creators recognized the role of the fundamental 4, stated or unstated, and listened to what families, students, and teachers were saying about how their materials had to change pretty quickly in many cases on the fly in order to make improvements given the situation on the ground. So we saw that they first and most importantly provided additional supports or changed the supports that exist to help educators, families use those materials in the moment. Those included things like technology-based improvements, making their materials available in more languages. It also focused on a number of content supports trying family guides and other things to particular lessons or subunits so that a parent wasn't left to say, oh, I have this one sheet that's going to help me learn how to do all of 7th grade math with my kid. And it went even further beyond content and those technical solutions to really thinking about the human side of teaching and learning and creating affective supports and other types of emotional supports to families that can make them feel empowered to help their kids at home. Similarly, we heard from teachers that although it was an incredibly draining year, we heard teachers speak with utmost enthusiasm for their relationships with families. And many teachers, as I'll speak to when we double click on the Fundamental 4 report, said that they felt like they had their best year of teaching yet because they knew their families and kids in ways that they had never previously.
So helpful, Liz, and I encourage everyone to read the report. I'd like to welcome Lauren into the conversation now. I'm just scrolling to make sure I can see you. Hi, Lauren. EdReports has long been the field leader in rating curricula for its adherence to standards and best practices. Have you seen, or what have you seen, in innovative and unexpected trends in high quality instructional materials of late? How have these curricula creators approached the homeschool connection, or what have you been hearing from teachers and leaders that they want to better understand about how high quality instructional materials can support that homeschool connection?
Thanks, Laurie. Well, to start, let me just say, read Liz's and CPRL's report if you haven't already about the fundamentals, because there are vignettes and stories from quotes from teachers in there that I think will make what I'm about to share, help make it even clearer. So one of the things that we saw happen with the pandemic is actually there was this like lifting of the veil where because more, particularly families, had access to see the type of curriculum and content that was being shared in classrooms and being shared, through Zoom or in workbooks that were stapled and handed out, it really revealed how few teachers have consistent access to high quality instructional materials. So all those wonderful benefits that Liz just shared about of having high quality instructional materials as a way to communicate and collaborate with families, only 26% of ELA teachers and 40% of math teachers have access to that really great content. And so one thing that we saw happen in the pandemic is this heightened awareness of like, oh, we need to do something. Let's lit a fire under a lot of districts and schools and states to reconsider, what are we saying students deserve and teachers deserve every single day? And so then how can we put in different policies, and how can we make sure that they're having access to that content? Because and you'll see this on the next slide, when you don't have access to the content, the role of teacher becomes really, really hard. And I think a lot of families experience the same, because you end up spending on average pre-pandemic, it was 7 to 12 hours per week searching for and creating your own materials. That's in addition to your classroom load, right? In addition to all the things that you're doing to make sure that you're like with your students. So when the pandemic hit, if you're searching for materials and learning how to teach on Zoom and trying to figure out like how to collaborate in this new way, it was, for those who didn't have it, it was challenging. And why this matters so much is because when you look online and you're looking for these, when you're looking for high quality resources online and doing this type of Google searching, which we know a lot of families had to do too, it's tough. It's tough to find the great stuff. There is great stuff out there, but in a 2019 study, it really showed that it's kind of like a needle in a haystack situation. And we had most of the materials aren't aligned to standards. And not only that, they aren't providing differentiation supports for your students, which is one of the key reasons that we know that that people first go online is, how can I help these students in front of me? So that's what the pandemic kind of revealed for people, but it also led to a lot of innovations. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see most standards aligned materials now at least claim to have technology that can facilitate learning, whether you're in person or you're at home. Now, notice that claim to have is in blue because it varies. And so there are some products like the ones that Liz was speaking about that actually provide guidance about how, why to teach the lessons that you're teaching, whereas another curriculum provider might just have like a single PDF sheet. One of the cool things that we have seen in the pandemic is the demand can drive changes to the products. So as more districts, states, schools, families are demanding better resources and supports, publishers are stepping up. And that type of demand is something we've seen districts put into an RFP process, for example. I'm looking for materials that support caregivers in understanding the math, 7th grade math example, the math and the why. And so when districts are explicit like that, we're able to see changes in the market. And then finally, teachers are so, just to Liz's point, they're so excited when they have the content and the material, and that enthusiasm that we heard from teachers who are going through, one of the toughest years to teach. It was resounding. We heard that in so many different arenas. Every time asking, when you had that high quality material, you were able to think about social emotional health, actually collaborate with the families, get to know your students better. And that, as an innovation, I think, being able to elevate those voices and hear from teachers about the value there has been really strong.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I love that you're using a quote from Liz's report.
I told you I really like it. It's a really great report.
So Liz, about the report, as now everyone knows, CPRL did recently publish Fundamental 4, and I'm going to read out the entire title now. Pandemic Learning Reveals the Value of High Quality Instructional Materials to Educator-Family Student Partnerships. Can you share some of the specific findings with us, especially as it relates to the role that a strong homeschool connection plays in the success of high quality instructional materials, and just acknowledging that this hasn't typically been something that we as a field have thought about. And so I think it's just reinforcing a lot of what Lauren and you already previously elucidated, but we would love to hear it from the research.
Thanks so much, Laurie. Yes, and I'll just say, for me personally, one of the really exciting things about this project was both to see the role of families and to see the role that curriculum plays in a new and really powerful light. So the Fundamental 4 report draws on our study of 9 school districts across 7 states during the last school year. We conducted over 290 interviews with families, educators, instructional leaders, and system leaders to look at the places where learning was occurring and figure out why learning was happening when it was happening, and what does that reveal about how the education system could be more equitable moving forward. So as we've already described, we see a shift in the role of teaching and what the instructional core actually is from this previous 3-sided, 3-pointed relationship to one with an additional point and an additional dimension, and that is of the family. In this 4-pointed relationship, the role of curriculum itself changed. High quality curriculum, when they were at play, played a coordinating role that allowed teachers, students, and families to work together to support high levels of learning. And what is really, really interesting, stronger teaching. We heard over and over and saw lots of evidence that this family, student, teacher, curriculum relationship meant that teachers were teaching at the best levels that they had in their own past. Importantly, all stakeholders reported that kids were learning as much or more than in a typical year when they had access to these high quality instructional materials and when the kids were receiving support from a family member or caregiver at home who was part of the instructional process. As I already started to mention, this benefit is more than the benefits you see from just using the curriculum alone. If you go to the next slide, you'll see bringing families into this process created both direct and indirect benefits for kids. It was direct because for each child, there's a direct benefit going from the caregiver, the family member who's involved, to that child with the support for their teaching and learning. But there's also an indirect benefit, because what we heard time and again from teachers was that by partnering with the families, teachers got better at teaching, and teachers were able to better serve their kids, both that individual child and their kids more broadly speaking. In the sites with the most success, this learning process became one of co-production, with the curriculum coordinating the collaboration of students, families, and schools. Families brought additional supportive and observational capacity to the instructional process and were able to name insights that teachers previously hadn't been aware of. There was a huge increase in cultural and community knowledge, so that teachers were able to speak and teach with culturally responsive practices at a level that they previously hadn't been able to. And there were more people supporting kids to help them meet their individualized goals. There are really big equity implications for this study that we want to call out separately. If you go to the next slide, please. And that is, first, a huge focus on inclusion. Kids, families, teachers, so that they felt more welcomed into the instructional process than they previously had, even when that instructional process was occurring over Zoom, when there was this four-pointed relationship. As I said, this helps all kids learn. We've seen and have lots of evidence that this is not something that is exclusive to particular families, particular teachers, or particular group of students. This four-pointed relationship is good for all kids. And it is a really, really authentic and local way to engage in culturally responsive practices. We often think of learning how to be culturally responsive by reading a book or going to some sort of outside training. And what we see here is that when teachers partner with the people to whom they're supposed to be responding, they're able to, on their own, do many, many things, especially when supported by the coordinating role of these curriculums to make their teaching speak to the kids in their classes in ways they previously hadn't.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that. Sarah, Teaching Lab was one of the professional learning providers featured in the CPRL report. And I'm hoping you can talk to us more about what you saw during COVID. Did you find that educators you work with had to change their practices to accommodate a better or different homeschool connection, or was that already built into your model and how those teachers already worked? Can you share any examples of best practices or innovations you saw educators engage in that you would like to share?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for this question. So again, I'm Sarah and I lead Teaching Lab, and we were privileged to be featured in the report that Liz has been talking about. And simultaneously, I have a 6-year-old. He's in New York City public schools, and he was in remote learning his entire kindergarten year. So not only was I in a place where we were supporting educators in New York and across the nation and making this giant shift to teaching in remote or hybrid contexts, I also had a literal window into that world myself with my son. And we put together these principles of remote learning by engaging educators and learning from what they were doing that was successful to meet the needs of this moment. And I'll say that we also learned from our own experiences as parents. At one point, my son said, "Help, I'm in a boring box of Zoom," because he was so bored and frustrated by being in remote learning all day. And so these principles that we created were also designed to increase student engagement during this difficult time period. And so in our work with educators, we advise them to, 1, prioritize, and selecting a high quality curriculum is a part of that prioritization process. Another part of that prioritization process is aligning the technology that you use with the high quality curriculum. Lauren talked about how some of these curricula are tech enabled, but there are also technological products that can be used for increased student practice, small group work time, et cetera, that are more aligned with certain curriculum. So for instance, if you're using Eureka Math and you want more time for individual student practice, you should be using Zearn because it's aligned with Eureka Math. We also supported many teachers that were using illustrative math, and they chose to use lessons from Desmos, which is aligned with illustrative math. And so we supported both teachers and school leaders and system level leaders in making those decisions. And speaking to Lauren's point, this prioritization is so important because it lays a foundation for teachers to not only raise the bar around what they expect students to be able to achieve, but it also allows them to focus more on the 3 other principles that we have here because they don't have to spend as much time lesson planning. So what we also learned from this pandemic era, and we knew this before, is that education, it's a human endeavor. It's all about student relationships. And we really, really need to see caregivers, parents, family members as partners in this critical work of ensuring that every single student in our nation learns on grade level and achieves their dreams. So when you have this strong foundation of a curriculum, teachers can actually spend more time on this. And in the report, one of the teachers that we supported said, "This year, more than ever, I find myself texting or calling parents." So I want to make a connection to what Alexis put in the chat. You really need to, what we supported educators in doing is meeting parents where they are. Like Alexis said, almost every parent has a phone, okay? So I'm sort of jumping to principle 4 that's on here, but we worked with educators to ensure that they didn't let their biases or assumptions around how parents should show up interfere with how parents wanted to show up. So maybe you don't want to have your video turned on. Maybe you don't want to join a Zoom meeting. Maybe you can't join a Zoom meeting. That's great. Doesn't matter. You can text, you can call, just any way to engage parents in their kids' learning is a good way to engage parents in their kids' learning. Additionally, we supported educators in establishing consistent instructional routines, which is also really, really helpful for families and caregivers because they know what to expect. So for instance, with my own son, my teacher would do a morning meeting and then they would do some whole class work, which would then transition into small group work and then some independent work. And as a caregiver, understanding that schedule would allow caregivers to determine how they're going to spend their time, especially with little kids, to support them in their learning. And finally, the 4th principle here is so important. And again, this is what we worked explicitly on with educators and intentionally on with them. And we continue to work on this, as you can see in the chat with some of the reports that have been shared. But just teacher mindsets and expectations for student learning matter. And in this era, teacher mindsets and expectations for how parents and caregivers were involved in their students' learning also really, really mattered. And so it'd be like, no, like, don't assume that a parent doesn't want to be involved. Maybe they just want to be involved in a different way, and you can find that different way, educator, and also the schools that we were working with. But what everybody should be asking is, okay, this all sounds good, but did it work? So you can see on the next slide that when we looked at teaching lab teachers versus non-teaching lab teachers, the teaching lab teachers that embraced a high quality curriculum as well as strong family and home connections during the pandemic, they actually engaged in more practices that are correlated with improving student learning. So I'll stop there, but you can see more about our impact in the reports that have been shared in the chat.
Thank you, Sarah. I love how you answer the questions that you know are going to come next. So thank you. Lauren, shifting back to you quickly, how can the reviews that EdReports does help people, whoever are reading them, to know how well the materials can support family engagement across a range of questions related to family engagement? What additional information have you heard people request during and since the pandemic, before the pandemic, et cetera?
Thank you, Laurie. I mean, the first way, and there's 3 steps laid out here, but the first thing that we recommend is ensure you've got great content and demand and design, right? So when we know that about materials, that you get really good content, they're in a way they're, usable, you can pick them up, you can, there's not a large lift, particularly for our teachers in order to enact them. Then in our reviews, you can find some more information about strategies for engaging and informing stakeholders, including students. We talk a lot about parent engagement, but also engaging the student in their learning. Guidance on how to draw upon student home language to facilitate learning, guidance to encourage teachers about how to draw upon cultural and social backgrounds to facilitate learning. There's a lot more information that you can get in our reviews after you look at the alignment to standards, assessment, things like that. There is some information here. I would say if you go to the next slide, and this gets a little bit to what we see in the chat, and there's the technology capabilities to see how technology can support family engagement. And this is not to say that the top technology, the most technological, the most digital product is going to be the right for your community. So getting this technology match is really important as you make new decisions about curriculum or you're considering what you already have. So here are some questions that we provide information on for materials that meet expectations for alignment and usability. So here's some more information that you can gain. As you do that though, I really encourage, going to the last slide here, I really encourage districts, school leaders, purchaser, whoever is making decisions about materials to consider how to reconsider, most likely, how they're engaging with families from the beginning. So bring in community members and family members as part of this decision. Say, hey, these materials are, these materials have all the right foundational elements of the content and lay them out there. How well do you like this functionality? Would you use this? What would you need us to do as a district in order to make this more accessible to you? The component about listening first, right? Before you even go and decide that you're going to get new materials, how do you talk to communities about what you want to do, what they want to do, and what they want to see in a next set of material? Because if we're redefining the relationship, including parents as part of the instructional core, their voices from the beginning are going to be really valuable as you define what quality is for your students, your teachers. One thing that we've heard a lot is how do I, what people want to know, how do I help teachers know how to communicate with parents and parents know how to communicate with teachers around the actual content? And so I think that is somewhat extended beyond what the actual curriculum is and into that connection to professional learning. So when we think about professional learning on the curriculum, how can we include and incorporate that, great execution of the materials, and not like scripted, but great execution of the materials requires this type of collaboration and communication with those who are with caregivers. And I think that is so far been an overlooked component, and I'm really excited to see that going forward.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And this leads perfectly right into the next section, which really is about how professional learning can support this homeschool connection. So Bryan and Sarah, I'd like to shift to innovation that you've seen in professional learning and development, something that has long been a part of teachers' expectations for that school year. But as we've just heard, and as we all know, Sarah perhaps more viscerally than others, the experience for teachers has undoubtedly been incredibly different these last 18 months. I would love for you to be able to share how your organizations have been able to deliver professional learning, which is the core of your expertise, and measure its effectiveness on teacher practices in a fully virtual format while maintaining the core features that you hold close. So let's start with you, Sarah, since one of the components that Teaching Lab had to add during COVID was a support for teachers who were teaching virtually for the first time. And how has that experience of, oh, sorry, I don't want to go too far into another question. I'll stop there, Sarah.
No, it's great. I really love this question because, so just to give you a sense of the scale in which we're operating, we serve about 5,000 teachers a year across 30 different school systems. And pre-March 2020, we were a 100 in-person professional learning organization. So we were always there in the schools with teachers doing job embedded coaching, engaging in professional learning, engaging in instructional walkthroughs. And when March 2020 hit, we had to reverse course exceptionally quickly. But we did have a little bit of an advantage because we had some funding from the Robin Hood Foundation to begin innovating around what we were going to call a blended professional learning model. So we had investigated learning management systems, and we had decided that we were going to build our own using Moodle open source code. And so when the pandemic hit, we were able to change course very quickly and start delivering virtual teacher professional learning. And what you can see is, if you look at our data at the beginning of the pandemic, when we first started delivering virtual professional learning, teachers didn't like it. I think they didn't like it for a lot of reasons. One, it's a pandemic. It was a really, really hard time period for them. And two, because we at Teaching Lab weren't good at it yet. And 3 months after we launched our virtual professional learning model, the satisfaction data, the data around whether or not participants felt like we were building a strong community of learners, all of that shot up again to pre-pandemic levels. So we were getting the same satisfaction levels that we were getting in our in-person delivery model. And now when we look at the data, we actually see that many educators prefer virtual professional learning. And for us, I think this is a huge benefit of this era and an innovation that can persist. Teachers like virtual professional learning more because it's more modular. They can fit it into like mini time periods during the day. They can join from anywhere. And they also really love having access to an LMS where they can engage in virtual discussion boards at times that are convenient for them. They also really like it because they can connect with teachers outside of their schools. So this came up in the report as well. Teachers now have, Facebook groups and group chats and things like that focused on implementing a common curriculum. And we see the same thing can happen through our professional learning. And so now, for instance, we're even engaged in regional teacher professional learning, where we work with, 100 teachers in Connecticut. And we hear time and time again that teachers just love connecting with other educators outside of their immediate school community. So that was a huge lesson for us because we thought that teachers would prefer in-person professional learning. We also thought that in-person professional learning would be more effective, but amazingly, and you can see this in the impact report that was shared in the chat, we've actually shown that we can still shift teacher mindsets and practices and impact on student learning, even in a virtual model. Although I'll come back to this in a second, I think we also need to wrap a really robust learning and research agenda around that to ensure that we are achieving the highest impact we possibly can with teachers and their school communities.
And Bryan, for you all, how has the experience of delivering professional learning gone for opportunity culture educators? I'm particularly curious to hear how you've been able to bring the multi-classroom leader model into a virtual setting.
Yes, well, first of all, I would double click on a lot of the things Sarah said. When we provide direct professional development to teacher leaders, we had the same experience Sarah had in terms of virtualizing it, and also in the success and the advantages of that model. So that was a real eye-opener for us as well. But I want to turn the question a little bit towards, as you said, Laurie, the multi-classroom leader's role in professional learning, because what we primarily do is help schools set up structures that provide professional learning to teachers every day, and that's the multi-classroom leader model. And so what the slide shows is when researchers have gone out and looked at how what happens when teachers join these teams led by multi-classroom leaders. This combines a couple of studies, one that was pre-COVID and one that was during 2021. What they both found was when teachers join these teams, their student growth jumps from the 50th percentile before joining on average to the 77th percentile of teachers. And you can see that's a range of outcomes across models. In reading, that's about 0.2 to 0.8 extra years of learning for the kids taught by the teachers on these teams. In math, it's an extra 0.3 to 0.7 years. Different ways to convert percentiles into years, but using one method, that's what we see. And we really chalk these gains up in large part to the professional learning team teachers are receiving from their multi-classroom leaders. It's more intensive than teachers usually receive, as I mentioned before, 6 or 7 hours a week, every day in some way, meeting as a team and or having an observation from a multi-classroom leader. So it's not just the occasional drop-in by a coach. It's also expert. The MCLs are carefully selected for being great teachers and having leadership competencies. And there's this sense of joint accountability that we see in our surveys where the multi-classroom leader is not just an available resource to the teacher, but is actually responsible for the whole team's student learning. And so that joint accountability really changes the dynamic of professional learning where it's not just, hey, I'm over here, I'm here to help you if you need help. It's more, we are jointly on the hook for these students' learning. So let's get down to work on how we can improve both of our practice. So we see that PL being provided by MCLs as being essential, and it's really on the job. It's not turning up for a session so much as it is every day, the MCL going to team teachers' classrooms, co-teaching with them, modeling, watching them teach, observing so they can meet with them later and give feedback. And then also working as a team, so meeting several times a week, looking at the content together, making sure they understand it, preparing for the lessons they're going to give, reviewing student data, making plans to adjust their learning over the course of the week. It's that intensive on the job, every day, every week work that really seems to be the key to the success of this model. And just what we saw during the remote period when teachers and students were at home trying to do this remotely was MCLs figuring out continuing the same kind of support in that environment. I'll send a link, I'll chat a link in a second with some examples of that and some stories. But if you think about these two modes, the second one of team meetings, that's a natural to go remote. And in some ways it was easier during pandemic because teachers had more flexibility in their schedules. MCLs could continue those team meetings pretty well over Zoom, just like we all had to do. And then the other mode, that observation, coaching on the job, in the classroom, co-teaching, modeling, also was a little bit more challenging to transition into the remote setting that could be done. Whatever platform the teacher was using to interact with their students, the multi-classroom leader could come into that platform and do those same things, co-teach, model, observe, and then have the same role as a supporter of that teacher over time. So I want to make it sound like it was easy or that it wasn't a challenging time for everyone, but that model adapted pretty well to the remote setting.
Thank you so much, Bryan. Knowing it wasn't easy, but so many of the things that you did during COVID are actually part of those core principles that you adhered to before COVID. And so, Sarah, I'm wondering, how has your approach to professional learning and development changed? And what do you think will be most important going forward? I think you've alluded and said some of these, but would love to hear it just sort of said one more time. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, and I also want to address Lauren's question in the Q&A, and I can connect these two questions together. So one, my big headline is don't believe the hype, okay? Be open to being surprised. That's what innovation is all about. And I think that sometimes we pretend in education that we know more than we actually do. So like I was saying, my whole team thought that teachers wouldn't like virtual professional learning and that it wouldn't be effective, and we were wrong. And we had to learn that. because we're forced to, but imagine instead that we intentionally seek out those opportunities to learn about what works, what doesn't, with educators, with families and communities, with students, so that we can dramatically improve teaching and learning. And so one thing that we're a part of at Teaching Lab is a group called the Research Partnership for Professional Learning, where we're trying to do faster and better research around teacher professional learning to truly figure out what works and what doesn't. Because again, like if we don't try new things, if we don't embrace innovation, then we're going to keep doing the same things over and over and keep perpetuating inequities. And I can connect this to Lauren's question. So Lauren shared in the Q&A that she's a former high school ELA teacher who unfortunately left because of the lack of support that her district provided. I feel for you, Lauren. We're seeing this more and more in the schools and systems that we support. And she wrote, they expected us to do more, all caps, without giving us time, all caps. This is real. So when we work with system leaders, we tell them there's two things that you need to do. Invest in your teachers in the way that they deserve, because if you don't take teacher learning seriously, you're not taking student learning seriously. And part of that investment is in time and expertise of coaches, professional learning providers, but really time is exceptionally important. We oftentimes expect teachers to do new and very difficult things very quickly, and we know that's not actually how humans learn. I know this is really difficult given the teacher shortages right now, but I want to connect it back to what David shared at the beginning of this presentation, where he showed a very creative way to organize a school schedule so that you could create more time for teachers to collaborate and learn with one another. But if there is any takeaway for system level leaders, use those ESSER funds, use those care funds to free up teacher time to learn the new things you want them to be able to do. Because just like students, if teachers don't have time to learn, they're not going to learn, and then they're not going to be able to serve their students effectively.
Thank you. I actually thank you for teeing up David. David, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation before we open it up to the full panel. Are there any other examples that you can share from your district and school partners on innovation and professional learning? And what are some of those main takeaways?
Yes, more and more to do. And so let me highlight a few, some we've talked about and some that Sarah mentioned and some that go a little bit further, and then I'll come to this slide in a sec. So I would highlight the work that Bryan's team has done around opportunity culture. It's just innovative, the focus on differentiated roles, team-based structures, and to Sarah's point, really using time differently. That's a path forward for us around the teaching job. And Lauren, I want to connect to your question in a moment as well. I think the example I showed you from Texas earlier and how that school is using extended time was exciting. I'd point to three others just off from some of the work that we've seen. Early in the pandemic, we profiled a school in Ohio called Lander Elementary that basically said what some schools here in Massachusetts did as well, which is we can't slice time into all these little slivers during the day. It's too much for kids. It's too much for teachers. It doesn't allow for the blocks of time, Sarah, that you were describing earlier. And so they went all the way and they created a specials day in a K-6 school. So every sixth day, kids have a half day of one special or maybe 2-hour blocks of 3 different specials, right? And they don't have it split in 40 minutes here, 30 minutes there, 30 minutes here. And so that's the time when teachers really get to plan. It's a really rethinking how we use time. The other types of things that we see in the field, we're super excited about models that take teacher residency and go a step further into really differentiating pathways into the profession. So thinking about what does a paraprofessional to teacher role look like? What does it look like to have associate teacher roles? You know, part of the challenge of all that we're describing here, and we are the resource and structures people at ERS, right? Part of the challenge that we're describing here is the rigidity of how we do school, and the rigidity in which we ask teachers to operate isn't conducive to the type of work that we're describing. So we have to break down that rigidity with more flexibility and more differentiation. And so models that say, you know what, an early career teacher, first year teacher, might have half a teaching load, right? And they're teacher of record for 40 kids instead of 80 or 100 or 120 in a high school. A last place I'll highlight, and then we'll come back to the slides, where I think there's some really exciting work happening is out in Arizona. The team at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College in Arizona is designing and implementing what they call a next education workforce. It is a absolute clear explication of the issues, of the ideas that we're describing here that we hope will both support teaching and learning and the sustainability of the teaching job, to some of the points, Lauren, that you were raising. And so these all have in common, right? We have different kinds of roles for people depending on where they are in their careers. We have teams, structures where people are not working in isolation. We have time that we use differently. We have ultimately some connection to compensation, right? And Bryan described that for multi-classroom leaders in particular. And we have support, right? From instructional experts that really go deep into the day-to-day work, and support from the system level to help principals and their teams organize their schools to make all of that happen. So if we go back to the slides, I'll put this in the framework that we use for thinking about professional learning from a structural standpoint. And when we study systems, and this is from Igniting the Learning Engine, when we study systems that are having success in improving quality of teaching and learning and doing it in a way that engages and supports teacher development, there's three factors that show up over and over again. They have that rigorous, comprehensive, engaging curriculum and aligned assessments. And that's got to be engaging for everybody, especially students, obviously, and tailored to the context in which you're working. They have meaningful time for collaboration that is about content. It is led by people who know the curriculum. And then the last piece here is they get feedback on a regular basis. It's not evaluative. And I know someone comes into my classroom and we talk and we see how it's going, and they model behavior for me and they show me how it works. And so those things together start creating the conditions where some of this greatness can happen. So from a technical standpoint, on the next slide, some of this is just like when I said earlier, some schools and districts are using people and time differently. This notion of just saying, hey, why is my schedule sacrosanct? What can I do differently? And that, Laurie, to one of your first questions, I think is part of the innovation that we saw last year, is we were forced to think about time differently. And some folks really took that to heart and built schedules that allowed for the collaboration and structure that we're describing. To come back as a last point to Lauren's question, what happens in schools when teachers don't have a voice, and how have others, leaders, been responding to this kind of conversation? I think there's a recognition in the field now, more than there has been, although I don't think it's new, that the teaching job as it's done right now is not a sustainable job for too many people. And while I do think that the headlines about teacher, the Great Resignation have not yet borne out, and I'm excited for us to start looking at the data to see what's happening this year. It's not far-fetched to understand that if we continue to structure a job that is difficult to succeed at, we are not going to attract enough people to do it well. And we're going to have more folks like you, Lauren, who said, you know what, this isn't how I can do it. And so organizations that are really lifting up teacher voice and doing so in service of the intersection of making teaching attractive and making teachers excellent, helping teachers be excellent, that's the key to this. I think, and so super excited about where that's starting to happen. But again, I think we are early days in starting to shift more resources and more attention towards the work that actually does set teachers up to be successful. And I think we've heard about a bunch of examples today of the conditions and the structures you can create that really do that.
Thank you so much, David. It's so helpful to hear this laid out this way. I want to ask a question of the entire panel, and I'll give you each a minute or two to respond to a question that I think you all have some perspective on, which is that how can high quality professional learning for educators improve that school-home connection and student outcomes? What needs to be done to ensure that this type of professional learning is reaching as many educators as possible in the years to come. Whoever goes off mute first gets to talk first. David, you're it.
I'll tag in first. You know, again, the work we do here at ERS is very much about what is the role of a system to create conditions to scale excellent practices that make learning and teaching and learning engaging and exciting and joyful in our schools. And so we do think, and this showed up in one of the chats as well, that there's this sort of the connection between the school system, the principal, and the educators in classrooms and all the different forms that takes. That is crucial for us to be able to say, hey, look, principals, how are we going to restructure time? How are we going to think differently about roles? In some districts, that implies rethinking contracts, that implies rethinking policy and regulation. A lot of the time, it requires just rethinking things we've been doing for a long time. And that is hard, especially at a time like now, where there are so many fires to put out. But I do think that there's room for us to look at our system leaders and saying, if the thing that we're doing right now is breaking from the inside and being broken from the outside due to COVID, this is our chance to build something better and different. And I would say with federal funding, you have a chance to build something alongside or in parallel to your current system with 2 or 3 years before you have to switch. And that is unheard of in education, right? If you want to make a change, usually you have to do it, flip from one thing to the other, right? Build the plane while you're flying it. Right now we have the space to build towards some of the types of things that Bryan and Sarah in particular are talking about, that we can be doing more of. And so the system leadership, creating the time and space and the capacity and the models for them to be able to help schools make that pivot in the midst of everything right now, that we think that is really crucial.
I can build on that and say that, you know, for our perspective, it's speaking of the system level, breaking down those silos between family engagement, family partnership, community partnership, and teaching and learning and all of the other departments that exist at the system, so that family and community partnerships can be integrated with the remainder of the work in the district, and then also at the school level and at the classroom level. In terms of professional learning content itself and the opportunity that affords for improving the school-family connection and partnership and subsequently student outcomes, we've spoken to some of the key points before, but you know, we have to acknowledge that there's a tremendous amount of racial and cultural mismatch between our teaching force and our student body and the families who are in our public school system. And as Sarah was saying, I think there is a role for professional learning to play in helping teachers have the amount of racial and cultural literacy and fluency they need to engage across lines of difference in ways that are really affirming for kids and families, so that we don't have some families and some kids feel welcomed into this idea of co-production and some families and kids who are not. And similarly, thinking about ways for teachers to be more equipped to communicate with families and families to communicate with teachers around content and curriculum. One of the things that we saw over the pandemic in our research was that there was much more uptake in terms of this conversation around teaching and learning and conversation around curriculum and how to support kids between families and the teachers, who are the trusted brokers in this case, over families and the system level. So a number of the systems that we studied, big systems like Detroit and Hartford, or small systems of just a couple of schools, saw that their centralized family supports in terms of the core of teaching and learning were much less utilized than the relationships and calling on teachers to help in that teaching and learning process. And so how can we help teachers help themselves and help others know how to engage with families and really help them help their kids around the high quality curriculum that we see. And I'll just, the last thing I'll say is related to one of the questions in terms of our teachers and our teachers and families thinking about high quality curriculum in the same way. And the example of Eureka Math was dropped in, which is one of the things that we heard a lot about from families was conceptual math and how challenging that is. And what I would say is, first, people are defining high quality in lots of different ways. And, you know, there's probably some assumption about what we mean when we say that term in this conversation today, I will say that in the Fundamental 4 report, we call for an expanded definition of high quality so that we're also thinking about supportive for families, tech-enabled, and culturally responsive and sustaining. The other thing I'll say is that there's a difference between parents and family members feeling like the curriculum is inaccessible to them and feeling that the curriculum is not of high quality or not teaching their kids the thing that it needs to be teaching their kids. And what families really want is both of those things. They want a curriculum that is teaching their kids the things that they need to learn in order to succeed in life, and they want to weigh in so that they can help their kids in that process.
Happy to jump in next. I think building on what's been said, teachers need professional learning that is concrete and clear and actionable. And that applies to the instructional practices that they should engage students with and the practices that they can use to engage caregivers and families. And so, for instance, a personal example is I picked up my son from school yesterday and his teacher said to me, your son needs to work on reading fluency, and I put 4 different books in his backpack that you should read with him at home. It took her 30 seconds to say, but demonstrated a ton of knowledge about my son and what I could personally do to support his learning. So that's what we support teachers to understand, is that a little bit can go a long way. And what you're not trying to get parents or caregivers to do is replace the teacher. We have teachers for a reason. And teachers are professionals for a reason. They're going to do things with my son that I don't have time to do and I don't have the expertise to do. But how can you bring them in a targeted, intentional, and strategic way so that they're building on what they're learning at school? And I think the elephant in the room, which I appreciate because I think this has been incredibly asset-based, this whole conversation. But the truth is that we do have a lot of students returning to school right now who have gaps in their learning, have unfinished learning, who need additional support. So that like crisp, clear, targeted advice for teachers to use when they're engaging caregivers so that we can ensure every student is reading, writing, and computing on grade level so they can achieve their dreams is exceptionally important. So that's what I would focus on in teacher professional learning during this era.
Lauren, I can go. You can have the last word on this one, but one thing that really strikes me here is just the enormity of the challenge that we're talking about. And just to pick up a few strands from this conversation, we could have had other conversations, but we've got the need for bringing high quality instructional materials into schools. We have the need to bring the best thinking about how to teach those materials well to students. We have the need for this to be culturally responsive in a way that we've never achieved in the past at scale. We have the need for a better home-school connection and teachers' role in creating that. That's a lot to ask of the nation's 3.5 million teachers. And so I guess the charge I would give us is, give the nation is, how can we use this moment of investment potentially to shift to a system that's much more likely to be able to do all those things and probably the other things that we could put on the list. And you're not going to be surprised to hear what I think that shift needs to be, because if teachers were organized into teams with strong leaders that had the roles, schedules, and the compensation structures that were supporting that team setup, we'd be in a much better position to do all these hard things than if it's 3.5 million teachers working by themselves every day trying to make the best use of all the links that have been put into the chat here on their own. If we could, the more we could make that one move towards a better structure, then we're much better able to make all of these other moves that we need to make towards meeting the many goals that we have that are potentially overwhelming, but could be more manageable with a better system.
Bryan, thank you for saying that we have an opportunity here. Like it's a wonderful silver lining. We've never seen funding like we're seeing coming, like states and districts like have resources that they haven't had before. And so the structural changes that you're proposing make a lot of sense. And this is a wonderful time where we don't have to pick one, two. Like, so there are, one of the things that I think a lot about is if we think about, picking some great curriculum, getting some great high quality instructional materials and aligned PL, we're talking about a generation of students that are going to be affected because you really only select every like 5 to 7 years. So Sarah's kindergartner gets great materials now. And when he's graduating from 7th grade, he's had great materials that entire time with teachers who have been learning about those materials and how to deliver them in the best ways that entire time. There's such an amazing opportunity for that focus and resources that are available now that haven't always been to facilitate that.
I love the positive framing and what the opportunity is here now. So I'm gonna, a poll just popped up. Please complete, all attendees, please complete the poll. I'm gonna ask the panelists one more question and ask that you guys sort of respond as quickly as succinctly as possible, which is that we know that professional learning on its own isn't enough to address so many of the things that we've all been talking about. And I'm wondering if we can just sort of spend the last few minutes with each of you saying, what is your point of view on the role that better preparation and development can have on teachers' desire to stay in the field broadly, similar to the point that Lauren was making about the kinds of support she did not feel she had in her school, and what the potential impact is on student learning. And I think this builds very nicely on what Lauren just sort of concluded on the last point. And maybe, Lauren, I will ask you one additional question when it comes to your time, which is, why is it that kids have not had the kind of access to high quality instructional materials that we've all been talking about lead to such wonderful impacts for them? And what can the funds do now, right? I think you've said it, but that would love to hear it one more time. And it's also been in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. Well, there's a few reasons, right? One of them is availability. So we didn't always have options across, and I'm really just talking about K-12, ELA, and math right now. Like, we haven't always had great options across K-12, ELA, and math for districts to select, for teachers to use, and kids to get access to. Now we do. And so the first thing we need to do is get those materials into teachers' hands. And that is insufficient because now we need them to be used. And so making sure that people have great content and are supported with professional learning, collaborative time, like the different things we can put in place to actually make sure that students are gaining that experience. Like, that is something that I'm very excited to be on this panel about, because we have people who are showing different models of ways that we can structure and support and train so that students actually are getting that access. So, and there's other research in the chat. I think Sarah just popped one in too. That's what I would say. Get the good stuff, help people use the good stuff. And I think we can.
Yeah, I would add to that, to Lauren's comment, 2 data points that might illustrate the magnitude of potential impact that we have. And there's no silver bullet here, but your question, Laurie, about early career and teacher training. So data point 1, and I included this in one of the Q&As, based on our work in districts all over the country, early career teachers in middle income schools, early career teachers in the lowest income schools are twice as likely to leave their jobs as non-early career teachers, and I mean only 3 or more years experience, in middle income schools. So just think about that for a second, right? If I have a school that is serving a very low income population, my early career teachers, 1 out of 3 of them are going to leave in a year. If I'm in a school in the same district that is serving middle income kids, my teachers who have been teaching for a couple of years, only 1 in 6 of them are going to leave. And so this idea of what do we do to support early career teachers starting before they become full-time certified teachers is hugely, the stakes are huge. So the second data point I'll share is from our work in Growing Great Teachers, which said, what is the benefit of investing in this question about the transition from higher ed into the teaching profession, and investing in the right materials and support that allows those teachers to be successful? And the number one impacts mathematically that you get is when you retain teachers for 2 extra years. That is more like, there are absolutely pathways into the profession that have demonstrated teachers are more prepared than those that aren't, but there's also a wide range of what happens for incoming teachers within any given program. So if you put those two things together, right, that our turnover issues and our instability issues in the schools are largely a function of rookie teachers in low-income schools not being supported, and the idea that when we do support them well, the biggest impact we get academically, let alone for school culture, is when we retain them. This whole idea of what professional support looks like, how do I avoid burnout, isolation, lack of preparedness, so much of that is embedded in the kinds of models that Liz and Lauren and Bryan and Sarah are describing here today. And so I would argue that is one of the most important investments that district teams can be making right now. And it's more than just throw money at X, right? Just the materials or just the leadership or just the time. It's the combination of those things that are really working to change experiences for teachers and turn that teacher, Sarah, your son's teacher, who I don't know how many years of experience that person has, but got them to the place where they can be doing the kind of work that they did.
Yeah, and if I can build on this, so my son's teacher has 6 years of experience and she's amazing. She's been at the same school during that time. But what we know about teachers, and I felt this when I was a teacher too, is what gets you up in the morning is the belief that you're going to make a difference in the lives of students. And so that's why I shared this research about the importance of these feelings of success. When I was a teacher, I taught, I was my own secretary. I fought with that copy machine every single day. You know, like you stay after school, you lead after school programs. You are, tasked with supporting not just the academic learning, but the social and emotional development of students. You have to deal with student trauma, you have to refer kids to like mental health services, all kinds of things like this. And now during this sort of like pandemic, easing into a post-pandemic era, we're putting more and more on the backs of teachers. Almost every single new thing that you hear talked about, more social and emotional learning, more support for mental health, all of that is awesome. And every single one of those initiatives is going to fall on the back of a classroom teacher. So when we're talking about working conditions and support for teachers and professional learning, that's what I see the role of better preparation and development can have on the teacher's desire to stay in the field and continue to impact student learning. If we, again, don't support teachers in learning new things and developing their own self-efficacy around being able to do those new things with students, they're going to feel frustrated just like any other human. During this really kind of difficult time, if they're feeling really unsuccessful, they're going to want to leave, like the participant in this webinar shared. So I just think it's incredibly critical for school leaders, for system level leaders to invest those resources into teachers, because they are the ones that want to succeed with students, and they're the ones that we're relying on to succeed with students.
Yeah, what Sarah said, that's all so important. And I would also add the importance of teacher candidates, because they're the future teachers. And right now they can play a key instructional role in schools, tutoring small groups, which we know has huge impact on student learning and can address that unfinished learning, and then prepare them even better for being teachers. So there's a huge opportunity around teacher candidates serving as residents, ideally paid in schools right now.
Liz, any last thoughts?
I was noting the time. I'll just wrap it up by saying Yeah, I think teaching and learning is a human endeavor, ultimately, like so many of the things that we do. Teachers want to be successful. They want to be successful for their kids, and they want to be successful as part of a team and have that strong sense of connectedness in those relationships. And those relationships don't just extend to other teachers, but they extend to the kids and the families and the communities who are so core to the job that they're trying to do. And as Sarah said, I think professional learning has a very, very crucial role to play in making sure that teachers have that efficacy, have that perceived efficacy, have the lived efficacy, and are doing that in community with all of the people who are at the heart of the work that they're trying to do together.
Thank you all so much. I so appreciate the dialogue and the discussion and all the learning that we all just got to experience with you all. Sarah, I'll turn it back over to you.
I'll just have to say ditto, huge ditto. This was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much to you, Laurie, for moderating it and helping to pull these amazing educator leaders together to share your insights. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Liz Chu, to Sarah Johnson, to David Rosenberg, to Bryan Hassel, and to Lauren Weisskirk. Really appreciate all of you joining us today. And I appreciate everyone who's been listening into this conversation, joining us as well. I hope you found it as informative, insightful, inspiring as I did. Really reinforces the idea of quality professional learning for teachers, but also making sure that teachers aren't responsible for doing all of these different things. We need to support them in the work that they do. Really appreciate that. I hope that everyone will join us again for some upcoming GLR Learning Tuesday sessions. We've got them posted on the screen. Next week, we're gonna have another double header, starting off with a Crucible of Practice Salon featuring the work in Indian River, Florida, followed by a special GLR Learning Tuesday session, which will feature Miriam Calderon, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Policy and Early Learning at the US DOE, which will examine the pandemic's impact on English language learners and the way in which education policy leaders and educators can advance equitable learning recovery. After the following week, we will have another funder to funder conversation in the earlier 12:30 p.m. time slot, exploring the ways in which local funders can take action to ensure that all children and families who are eligible are able to access the child tax credit and that it is extended into future years so that more families can receive it and it can have its child poverty reducing impact. Registration links for all of those are posted in the chat box. Again, I'll say thank you to our amazing panel. Thank you to all who joined in, and I hope to see you all at future GLR Learning Tuesdays. Take care.